The Whitlock house stood on the edge of town like a monument that never stopped changing, its frame stretching upward and outward year after year, as if the wood itself breathed and demanded more. Neighbors whispered that it was a place that seemed to swell with unseen weight, its windows multiplying like watchful eyes, its hallways growing longer than the measure of the land beneath it. The Whitlocks had once been ordinary, a middle-class couple who worked the land and carried themselves with quiet manners that kept suspicion far away. But after the loss of their firstborn, a boy named Elias, the family began to expand in unnatural ways, not by their own blood, but by bringing in children who were not theirs. They adopted one boy, then another, each one a fragile orphan with no ties, each arriving with nothing but a trunk of second-hand clothes. What unsettled the town was not the adoptions themselves, but the fact that each child was renamed Elias, as if the original boy had never truly died and was being rebuilt piece by piece. In church, when the Whitlocks introduced each new boy, they spoke his name with pride, as though the sound itself held power. Congregants would murmur that it was a strange devotion, yet no one challenged them. To the community, the Whitlocks seemed charitable, noble even, rescuing children from orphanages where hope had already withered. But behind the closed doors of that ever-growing house, the air carried a silence that no visitor could quite explain. The Whitlocks never allowed the boys to speak freely, never let them laugh too loudly, never let them show themselves in ways that strayed from the shadow of the first Elias. Every toy belonged to Elias. Every bed was Elias's bed. Every photograph taken was marked only with that single name. Slowly, the house itself seemed to conspire with this illusion, swallowing the individuality of each boy until they appeared not like brothers, but like ghosts trying to mimic one life. The neighbors noticed small things, though they never dared to press. They noticed that the Whitlocks extended their fence each time a new child came, adding rooms, digging new cellars, raising new chimneys. They noticed how the curtains were always drawn, even on warm days when every other home on the street let the sun in. They noticed how no matter how many children were brought in, only one would ever be seen at a time, usually standing stiffly beside Mr. or Mrs. Whitlock, dressed in the same pressed suit, staring blankly ahead as if rehearsed. The others were said to be studying, or resting, or unwell. Over time, whispers hardened into suspicion, but suspicion was swallowed by the town's need to believe in kindness. After all, the Whitlocks were not drunkards, not cruel in public, not loud. Their evil was quiet, and quiet evil often goes unnoticed. Inside the house, a different truth festered. The Whitlocks carried the memory of their dead son like a relic, treating his absence as though it had left a hole in the world that only rituals could fill. Each adopted boy was told he was Elias, but not in a way that honored him. He was trained, molded, punished into becoming a replacement, a vessel to continue the Whitlocks' illusion that death had not touched them. The house was not simply growing in wood and brick. It was growing as a machine of control. Every new room was designed with purpose. A locked study where records were kept, a chamber with no windows for nightly isolation, a cellar where silence was demanded like worship. For the Whitlocks, each addition was not an expansion of comfort, but an expansion of ritual, a physical attempt to contain death itself. The townspeople told stories about the house at night, how it groaned when the wind hit it, how its chimneys exhaled smoke long after midnight, how its doors never seemed to be opened by the children themselves, only by the parents. Yet none of these stories broke through the illusion of decency that the Whitlocks built around themselves. It was easier to call them eccentric than dangerous, easier to believe they were grieving parents than to imagine the truth, that they had turned grief into obsession and obsession into cruelty. The name Elias had become a chain, binding every boy who entered to a destiny already written, a destiny shaped by people who smiled in public and prayed in church, but who were quietly engineering a horror that no one dared to see. The house that kept growing was not just a house. It was a monument to denial, a shrine where innocence was consumed and remade in silence, preparing the stage for tragedies that had only begun. The first boy arrived with hollow cheeks and restless eyes, an 8-year-old taken from an industrial orphanage where children were treated like tools to be used and discarded. He was small for his age, frail enough that the Whitlocks could lift him like a doll. Yet to them he was not a child, but a canvas upon which they would paint the image of their dead son. The moment he stepped into the house, he was given a new name: Elias. The name was spoken not as comfort but as command, a word that chained him to a ghost he had never met. From that moment forward, every trace of his past was erased. He was not permitted to mention where he came from, not allowed to remember his own name. He was told that such memories were lies, impurities that would corrupt his new soul, and so he learned to keep silence, because silence was survival in that house. The Whitlocks introduced him to routines that seemed ordinary at first, but each held a darker purpose. Dinners were rituals of silence. The boy would sit at a long wooden table, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock. He was not allowed to speak or ask for food, and if his eyes wandered anywhere but the plate, a hand would strike the table sharply enough to rattle the cutlery. Each bite had to be chewed 33 times, no more, no less, and if he faltered, his plate would be taken away, leaving him hungry until the next day. To outsiders, the Whitlocks appeared devout and disciplined, but inside their home, meal times were ceremonies designed to break the child's natural rhythm and rebuild him into something mechanical, predictable, obedient. Nights were worse. When the lamps were dimmed and the house sank into shadow, Elias was led to the cellar. There, a small cot waited in a locked room where no sound from upstairs could reach. The walls were bare stone, damp and cold, and the only light came from a candle placed in the corner, burning down slowly until he was swallowed in darkness. He was told that the cellar was where souls were purified, that the silence would cleanse him of who he used to be. In truth, it was isolation engineered as devotion, a methodical stripping away of comfort, forcing him to exist only with fear in his own thoughts. Hours stretched into eternity, and each night he was reminded that this was the price of becoming Elias. When he failed to follow the Whitlocks' rules, punishment came in forms so strange they felt like experiments. The cruelest involved mirrors. They would place him in front of a tall mirror, make him kneel, and force him to look at himself for hours while a recorded prayer played on a phonograph behind him. The prayer was monotonous, endlessly repeating lines about purity, obedience, and rebirth. He was told to stare at his reflection until he no longer recognized it. If he looked away, the Whitlocks would grip his face and turn it back, whispering that the old boy inside him was still alive and needed to die. After these sessions, he would emerge dazed, unsure if the person staring back at him was himself or the ghost he was forced to become. This system was not madness without shape. It was deliberate, methodical, and terrifyingly calm. The Whitlocks believed they were reshaping a soul, erasing the flawed humanity of an orphan and crafting him into their dead son reborn. Each ritual had meaning to them, though to the boy it felt like torture disguised as piety. His laughter, his hunger, his identity, even his reflection were stripped from him layer by layer, leaving only the name Elias hollow and echoing. And as the weeks passed, the boy began to fold into the role, not because he believed it, but because survival demanded submission. The Whitlocks did not see his fear as cruelty. They saw it as progress, the proof that their rituals were working. They believed they had given life back to their son. In truth, they had buried another child alive inside himself, the first in a long line of sacrifices to a name that would never rest. The first Elias vanished as quietly as he had arrived. One week he was seen walking stiffly beside Mr. Whitlock on the way to church, pale and withdrawn. And the next, he was gone. The Whitlocks told neighbors that he had fallen ill with fever, that his frail constitution had finally failed him, and that God had called him home. In a town that often lost children to sickness and accident, no one questioned the explanation. A few mothers whispered uneasily that they had never seen a doctor visit the house, but their doubts dissolved beneath the Whitlocks' composed grief. The family carried themselves with the dignity of mourners, but inside their home there was no mourning. The boy's absence was treated not as death, but as a vacancy, an opening to be filled. Within months, another child was brought from an orphanage, another boy with no family to claim him. The town greeted the act with admiration, saying the Whitlocks had courage to love again so soon. They smiled and nodded, and when they introduced him, they said his name with pride. Elias. The second boy entered a house already prepared to strip him of himself. Where the first had been forced into silence and isolation, the second was subjected to rituals more severe, as though the Whitlocks had learned from their experiment and refined their methods. This Elias was forbidden from touching his own face, forbidden from using the first person when he spoke, forbidden even from writing his thoughts. Each act of self was labeled a sin. When he faltered, punishments were crafted not to inflict random pain, but to symbolically erase him. The Whitlocks cut his hair in jagged patterns, leaving him with a scalp scarred by deliberate burns from heated scissors. They marked his skin with shallow cuts arranged in lines, saying they were cleansing him of the orphanage he came from. He was told that every scar was a seal against the past, that each mark made him less of who he was and more of Elias. His body became a canvas of disfigurement, not broken for cruelty alone, but reshaped into sameness, made interchangeable. The neighbors did not see the scars. They saw only the boy dressed neatly in pressed clothes, eyes lowered, standing between two parents who radiated calm piety. They did not notice that the boy never looked directly at them, that his hands were always hidden inside sleeves, that his lips trembled when asked his age. They chose not to notice. To them, the Whitlocks were pillars of generosity, people who rescued lost children and gave them homes. It was easier to believe the story than to see the cracks in it. And so the pattern began, unnoticed and unchallenged. One child gone, another in his place, each given the same name until individuality itself was a kind of death sentence. Inside the house, the rituals grew harsher still. The second Elias was forced to sit before the same mirror where the first had been broken, but now the Whitlocks introduced new rules. He was made to hold his breath while staring at his reflection, timed by a pendulum clock that ticked loud and merciless. Each time he failed, his punishment was to wear a linen shroud over his body for hours, a living rehearsal of death, so that he would never forget his role as the resurrected. At night he was bound in tight wrappings, not allowed to stretch or move, as though the Whitlocks were molding his body into a shape that pleased their dead son's memory. These acts were not performed in anger, but with a terrifying calm. They did not scream at the boy. They whispered. They prayed. They spoke to him as if he were sacred, as if breaking him was not cruelty but devotion. The second Elias lasted longer, but the scars of ritual cut deeper than flesh. His voice grew weak, his will collapsed, and his identity shriveled under the weight of forced sameness. By the time the neighbors saw him again in church, they whispered that he seemed older than his years, as though he carried grief no child should know. None of them understood that he was not grieving himself, but the boy he used to be, the one erased by ritual, the one no one remembered. And when he too disappeared, the Whitlocks would once again say the word that silenced suspicion: fever. The town would nod, relieved that tragedy explained what they could not face. And soon after, another boy would arrive, another vessel for the same name, and the cycle of silence would continue, tightening like a rope that no one dared to see. In a locked drawer within the Whitlock home lay a book that no visitor ever saw, a heavy leather-bound ledger that bore no title on its cover. To the Whitlocks it was sacred, a record of their devotion, but to any other it would have been a document of madness. Inside, page after page held clinical notes written in steady, practiced handwriting, as though the horrors described were nothing more than household accounts. Each entry carried the same heading, Elias, and beneath it a list of what they called corrections. These corrections were not punishments in the common sense, but systematic mutilations dressed in the language of purification. The Whitlocks believed that to erase the self they had to carve away the human layers until only the image of their dead son remained. The notes revealed methods that turned childhood into ritual suffering. The children were made to sleep not in beds, but in narrow wooden boxes shaped like coffins, lids pulled shut so tightly that air passed only through small drilled holes. The ledger recorded the hours each boy lasted before panic overtook him, and how long it took for that panic to fade into resignation. This, the Whitlocks wrote, was proof that fear could be burned away with repetition, that silence could be trained into the bones. Other entries described the removal of nails from fingers and toes, written coldly as purification of extremities, as if the parts of the body that touched the earth were unclean. Sometimes teeth were pulled, recorded as cleansing the mouth of false words, each extraction a ritual to silence the past. What was done in pain was justified on the page as necessary, a sacrifice for rebirth. Most disturbing of all were the descriptions of symbolic disfigurements. The ledger detailed how scars were carved, deliberately into patterns, circles or crosses etched on skin not as random cruelty but as marks of possession. One boy's back was cut in parallel lines to mimic the rungs of a ladder, described as steps leading upward to purity. Another's arm was branded with a symbol resembling the letter E, the Whitlocks noting with satisfaction that the child would never again be mistaken for anyone but Elias. These marks were their signatures, their way of denying the boys the dignity of being remembered as individuals. Each scar was a seal of ownership, a rewriting of flesh that said the old name was gone. The language of the ledger was chillingly calm, without rage or apology. The Whitlocks did not see themselves as abusers, but as caretakers of a sacred project. They wrote that each child was improved, cleansed, refined, as though suffering were a tool to polish away imperfection. In their minds, these rituals were not crimes, but devotions, the work of parents chosen by grief to defy death itself. Where others saw broken children, they saw progress. Where others would hear screams, they heard prayers answered. The book itself became more than a record. It was their scripture. Every act inflicted on the boys was first imagined on those pages, planned in neat handwriting before being carried out in the darkened rooms of the house. The Whitlocks believed that by writing it down, they gave permanence to their rituals, ensuring that even if bodies failed, the order they created would endure. The ledger was not hidden out of shame, but out of protection, kept safe until the day the world would understand. Until then, it lay waiting in the shadows, its pages filling with bone-deep truths, preparing to reveal not only what was done, but why it was done, a testament to evil that pretended to be devotion. The third Elias was different. Unlike the two who came before him, he carried a spark that the Whitlocks could not snuff out easily. He tested their rules, broke their silences, and once in the dead of night he tried to escape through a window. The attempt was clumsy, the desperate scramble of a child too young to understand the vastness of the world outside. He was caught before his feet even touched the ground, dragged back into the house with hands that did not tremble, for the Whitlocks did not see disobedience as failure but as opportunity. In their minds, resistance was proof that the boy's old self still clung to life, and so a harsher ritual was required to burn it out. What followed was not a punishment born of anger, but an experiment in erasure, designed with the cold patience of people who believed they were chosen to reshape souls. The room was prepared in silence. Its walls, once bare stone, were coated thick with soot and lime dust, substances chosen not for accident but for their corrosive effect. The Whitlocks understood their poisons in ways that made them seem less like grieving parents and more like engineers of suffering. The boy was locked inside with nothing but a cot and a bucket of water. Each breath he drew carried particles that seared his throat, tore at his lungs, and burned his eyes until tears carved streaks down his blackened cheeks. His skin began to peel in patches, first at his hands and arms, then at his face, the lime dust stripping him like bark from a tree. At night, when the air grew damp, the mixture turned sticky, clinging to his skin, burrowing into his pores. The Whitlocks wrote in their ledger that this was a cleansing chamber, a place where the old life would be shed like ash. To them, the boy's suffering was not cruelty, it was progress. Days stretched into weeks. At first, the boy screamed, His voice cut through the floors, but the house was built to swallow sound, and the Whitlocks let him cry, noting how long it would take for the screams to weaken. When his voice broke into ragged whispers, they listened with satisfaction. When the whispers dissolved into coughs, they marked it as proof that the chamber was working. His meals were slid through a narrow slot, always the same bland broth, just enough to keep his body alive, but never enough to ease the pain. Each sip burned his raw throat, each swallow a reminder of the dust that clung to his insides. The boy tried to claw at the walls, tried to scrape away the soot, but his fingers bled and the dust only grew thicker. He began to lose his sense of time, trapped in a place where light and dark blended into endless haze, where every breath felt like swallowing fire. The Whitlocks watched him decline with the calmness of surgeons. They did not comfort him. They did not rage at him. They observed, recorded, adjusted. To them, the experiment was proof that even resistance could be broken into silence. They believed that by stripping the boy's body of breath, they were also stripping his soul of defiance, leaving behind only the vessel of Elias. Weeks later, when his voice was gone and his body collapsed in silence, they saw not death but completion. He had not escaped them. He had been remade. The soot clung to the walls long after he was gone, a black residue of lungs emptied and skin burned away, a tomb without a coffin. To the world outside, the Whitlocks would say another fever had taken him. Inside their home, they knew it was not sickness but ritual that had silenced him forever. The Whitlocks' home grew quieter with each passing year until silence itself seemed to leak from its walls like a presence. Neighbors remarked in hushed tones that they never heard laughter from the children, never the sound of games in the yard, not even the crying that was natural to boys forced to live under strict rules. The Whitlocks claimed they were raising the boys in discipline, teaching them composure. But the truth behind those closed doors was far darker. The silence was not the byproduct of obedience. It was the product of ritual. For the Whitlocks, sound itself was rebellion, and rebellion was sin. To kill it, they crafted ceremonies of suffering that unfolded in the dark hours of the night. Each evening, as the lamps were extinguished and the house fell under shadow, the boys were summoned one by one to the cellar. There stood a wooden chair carved with straps at its arms and legs, a crude but deliberate instrument of restraint. Each Elias was bound to it, his head tilted back, his body locked into stillness. On a nearby brazier, a small iron tool was heated until it glowed faint red. The Whitlocks believed that the tongue was the source of corruption, the vessel of unwanted words, and so it had to be purified. With mechanical calm, they pressed the heated iron against the soft flesh of the child's tongue. The pain was sharp but controlled, not enough to burn through completely, but enough to swell the tongue, to blister it, to make speaking agonizing for days. The ritual was repeated night after night until speech itself became a memory too costly to attempt. The Whitlocks noted in their ledger that the boys learned silence quicker under this method than any other. They recorded with satisfaction that prayers, when whispered through swollen tongues, carried more sincerity. The rituals did not end there. Silence was demanded even in the body. If a child whimpered or shifted, the Whitlocks would prolong the ceremony, forcing him to sit bound in the chair for hours, his tongue throbbing, his body aching under the straps. If his eyes watered, he was told the tears were his impurities leaving him. If he fainted, they revived him only to continue the process. The cellar became a chapel of silence, the chair its altar, the iron its holy relic. For the Whitlocks, these were not punishments but sacred acts, each session another step in erasing the voice of the orphan and raising the voice of Elias. Over time, the effects became visible. The boys rarely spoke even in daylight, and when they did, their words were slurred, broken, barely audible. Neighbors noticed their lips trembled when asked questions as though they feared each sound would betray them. The Whitlocks explained this away by saying their sons were shy, devout, humble. People believed them because what other explanation could there be? Who would imagine that a child's silence was not innocence, but the scar of nightly ritual? To those who passed by the house, the absence of laughter was unsettling, but unsettling was not the same as proof. And so the silence spread, thickening around the house until it seemed to radiate from its very walls, an aura of death that neighbors felt but could not name. Inside, the Whitlocks grew more convinced that they had perfected their system. They saw the silence as holy, proof that the boys were closer to their lost son than ever before. Each child's muffled voice, each hesitant glance, each swallowed cry was celebrated as evidence that the past had been erased. What they had in truth created was not a family but a graveyard that breathed. A household where the living were already half dead, muted by pain and fear. The Whitlocks' obsession had crossed from cruelty into liturgy, transforming their home into a shrine where silence was not just demanded but worshipped. And as the night stretched on, the rituals of silence bound the children more tightly than any rope, erasing them voice by voice until only the name Elias remained, echoing without laughter, without tears, without life. The fourth Elias entered a house already heavy with silence, a silence thickened by rituals that had swallowed the laughter and voices of the boys before him. But unlike the others, his purpose was different. The Whitlocks had grown restless. Erasing identity was no longer enough. They wanted more than control, they wanted permanence. Their grief had twisted into obsession, and obsession demanded proof that Elias, the son they had lost, could be kept alive in body even if not in spirit. The fourth boy was not treated as a child but as a specimen chosen for what they called immortality experiments. His small frame became the stage for grotesque trials meant to test the limits of life and death, and the Whitlocks carried them out not in rage but in calm determination, convinced that each act was holy. The experiments began with ice. The boy was lowered nightly into a bath filled with freezing water, the kind that cut into the skin like blades. His body would convulse, teeth chattering, lips turning blue as the Whitlocks watched with notebooks in hand, timing how long it took for him to lose consciousness. They believed cold suspended the soul, that death could be paused if the body was kept near frozen. When he fainted, they wrapped him in salted cloths, pressing the burning fabric against his skin to dry him out, to preserve him like meat hung for winter storage. His screams were muffled, not only by the salt searing his flesh, but by the Whitlocks' conviction that pain was the sound of progress. They did not soothe him when he writhed. They recorded how long it took for the skin to blister, How long it took before he no longer resisted. Starvation followed. The boy was fed less each day until his body weakened, his ribs visible beneath his skin, his movements sluggish, his eyes dim. The Whitlocks wrote that near death was the moment when the soul loosened its grip on the flesh. And it was in that space between life and death that immortality could be discovered. When the boy collapsed into unconsciousness, they did not treat it as danger, but as triumph. They would pierce his skin with long needles, pricking his arms, chest, and even beneath his fingernails to jolt him back, recording with satisfaction how the body could be forced into returning again and again. Each revival was celebrated as evidence that death was not permanent, that the name Elias could be preserved against nature itself. As weeks passed, the boy's body became a grotesque shrine. His skin bore salt burns, needle scars, frostbite marks that never healed. His eyes grew hollow, not with the normal sorrow of childhood, but with the emptiness of someone kept in a state where living and dying blurred. He no longer played, no longer spoke, no longer resisted. He drifted between shivering fits and fainting spells, his body an altar upon which the Whitlocks laid their faith. They dressed him in white linen to mark him as sacred, paraded him through the house as though he were proof of their devotion, but the neighbors only saw a pale, sickly child and believed he was delicate by nature. None of them understood he was being held in a cruel suspension, a living corpse kept upright by ritual. The Whitlocks believed they were close to victory. In their ledger they wrote that Elias was now beyond ordinary death, that he had learned to cross the boundary and return, that the cycle of suffering had bound him to eternity. But the truth was simpler and darker. The fourth boy had been stripped of everything, voice, will, flesh, even the comfort of dying. He existed only as the Whitlocks' experiment, a fragile body forced to carry the impossible weight of their grief. His suffering was not a failure to them, it was the proof they craved, the illusion that they had defeated loss. In reality, they had only built another tomb inside their home, a tomb that breathed, a tomb that whispered no prayers, a tomb where childhood had been buried alive under the name Elias. The Whitlocks' silence could not remain invisible forever. By the time the fourth Elias had withered into a pale relic of ritual, whispers in town began to sharpen into unease. Mothers remarked that the boys were seen less and less, always stiff and quiet when they did appear, always dressed the same as if time itself never touched them. Some wondered why the Whitlocks seemed untouched by grief despite burying more children than most families could endure. At last, a parish priest, bound by duty to the souls of his congregation, decided to see for himself. He did not go alone. 2 townsfolk, uneasy but curious, accompanied him to the house that had grown taller, darker, and more secretive with each passing year. The Whitlocks greeted them with politeness that bordered on charm. Mrs. Whitlock laid out bread, cheese, and tea, offering it with a warmth that disguised the coldness beneath her eyes. Mr. Whitlock spoke calmly about faith, about duty to the less fortunate, weaving words that sounded like scripture but felt rehearsed. When the visitors asked after the boys, the Whitlocks called for them, and soon 3 young faces appeared in the doorway. They were dressed neatly, their hair combed, their lips stretched into fragile smile. The priest watched carefully and noticed the stiffness in their movements, as though the smiles were masks pinned too tightly to their faces. Their eyes darted toward the Whitlocks before answering even the simplest questions, and their voices were low, almost rehearsed. Yet, to the untrained ear, nothing seemed amiss. The priest and his companions were shown a household that looked on the surface orderly and devout. What they were not shown were the hidden passageways, the locked cellars, and the narrow rooms where silence was beaten into bone. Behind the walls, pain was buried under careful construction, the house itself designed as both stage and disguise. The priest could not see the chair in the cellar where tongues were branded. He could not smell the faint trace of salt and soot that clung to the stone beneath the floorboards. He could not hear the muffled cries that had been trained into silence. The Whitlocks revealed only what they wished, and they revealed it with such composure that doubt struggled to find a foothold. The visitors left the dining table with their hunger satisfied, but their unease unsettled. Yet something lingered. Before leaving, the priest's eye was drawn to the portraits on the wall. Frame after frame painted in oils, each depicting the same boy. At first he thought they were simple memorials, images of the Whitlock's lost child Elias. But the longer he studied them, the more he noticed subtle changes. In one portrait, the nose was slightly sharper. In another, the jaw thinner. In another, the eyes larger and darker. Each painting was a blend, a layering of faces over the original likeness, as though each new child had been folded into the same portrait, erased into the same memory. There were no individual pictures of the adopted boys, no images that gave them names of their own. There was only Elias, repainted again and again, immortalized not as he truly was, but as the Whitlocks demanded him to be. The priest left the house with a chill that food and tea could not warm. In his private notes, he recorded his unease, writing that the Whitlocks seemed less like parents and more like curators of a shrine to one child who had died and been reborn countless times. He did not confront them, for he had no proof beyond the stiffness of smiles and the uncanny repetition of a single name. The townsfolk who accompanied him dismissed their discomfort, saying the Whitlocks were merely peculiar in their grief. But the priest's words lingered, buried in church records, warnings that would be unearthed only when it was too late. For now, the Whitlocks' illusion held, and the suffering behind their walls remained hidden. The house stood proud, its portraits gazing down with the frozen eyes of Elias, a gallery of children erased into one ghost. By the time the fifth Elias entered the Whitlock house, the family's cruelty had hardened into something polished, a system without hesitation, a ritual so rehearsed that each step unfolded with the precision of a liturgy. The earlier children had been subjects of trial and error, their pain serving as lessons for the Whitlocks to refine their methods. But now the parents moved with certainty, their cruelty no longer experimental but perfected. The fifth boy was not greeted as a child, not even as a replacement son, but as a specimen destined to complete their vision. His small hands were taken, his name erased, his future rewritten before he could resist. The Whitlocks believed they had achieved mastery over silence and obedience, but mastery was not enough. They wanted permanence etched not only into memory but into flesh, something that would prove Elias was eternal. And so the boy was chosen for what they called skin mapping. The ritual began with fire. The Whitlocks heated thin metal rods until they glowed faintly red, not enough to char deeply but enough to burn with surgical precision. The boy was stripped and laid on a table, his body trembling while their hands moved with frightening calm. They pressed the rods into his skin, creating shallow burns that cut lines across his arms, chest, and legs. But the marks were not random. They followed patterns drawn in their ledgers, patterns that resembled the veins of a leaf, branching outward in delicate symmetry. The Whitlocks believed the body should mirror nature, that by inscribing Elias into the design of creation itself, they were binding him to life everlasting. With each press of the iron, the boy's skin blistered, the air filling with the smell of scorched flesh. But the Whitlocks spoke softly as though guiding a prayer, telling him he was being purified, telling him he was becoming eternal. Days turned into weeks and the burns became scars. The Whitlocks reopened them again and again, tracing over old wounds to make the patterns permanent. The boy's body was studied as if he were a specimen, his pain recorded meticulously in their notes. They measured how the scars healed, how the lines darkened, how the branching spread across his torso like the skeleton of a tree. They believed each mark carried meaning, that each scar was a root binding Elias to the earth, a vein carrying his name into the future. The child himself became less a person and more a page in their book, his flesh a surface upon which their grief was written. He no longer slept without pain. His body ached with every movement, every breath pulling against scarred skin. He learned not to cry, not because he accepted his fate, but because his tears only made the Whitlocks repeat the ritual longer. The neighbors saw nothing. When they asked about the boy's absence, the Whitlocks claimed he was sickly, confined to bed by another bout of fever. They spoke of their devotion, of their endless burden of caring for children cursed with weakness. The townspeople, unwilling to dig deeper, nodded with sympathy and praised the couple's sacrifice. Meanwhile, beneath the floorboards of the Whitlock house, the fifth Elias was slipping further into silence. His body was covered in scars that no one would see, scars carved not by accident but by intent, each line an erasure of self, each branch a monument to a child long dead. He was kept alive only long, enough to serve his purpose, long enough for the Whitlocks to declare their ritual complete. When at last his body gave out, when starvation, infection, and exhaustion combined to smother the last spark of breath, the Whitlocks did not weep. They carried him into the cellar, pried up the wooden boards, and placed him beneath the house like a relic. He was buried without ceremony, no stone, no coffin, only the weight of the house pressing down upon him, erasing him into the foundation of their shrine. The Whitlocks reported his death with the same story they had used before. Fever, they said, weakness of the flesh, a tragedy, but one they bore with grace. The town believed them, relieved once again to accept the simplest explanation. Above ground, the Whitlocks carried on their routines. Below ground, beneath the creaking floorboards, the fifth Elias lay hidden, his skin etched in patterns of pain, his body another silent proof of the Whitlocks' devotion to a name that refused to die. The sixth Elias arrived at a time when the Whitlocks understood suspicion could be dangerous. Whispers had begun to ripple through the town, stirred by too many fevers, too many vanished boys, too many portraits with the same face. The Whitlocks knew they needed to appear beyond reproach, so this child was treated differently in public. He was dressed in the finest clothes, his hair oiled and combed, his shoes polished to a shine. They paraded him through church, let him carry hymn books, allowed neighbors to see him walking in the yard. He was permitted to smile when others watched, and on Sundays Mrs. Whitlock even let him sit in her lap, stroking his hair with the softness of a doting mother. To the outside world, he was the proof that the Whitlocks were not cursed, not cruel, but generous guardians who gave their love without measure. People in town began to speak of them with reverence again, pointing to the boys' clean clothes and calm manners as evidence of their goodness. No one suspected what happened when the doors closed, when night fell, and the house shed its mask. For in the cellar, the sixth Elias became subject to a ritual unlike any before. The Whitlocks had grown obsessed not just with silence or obedience, but with physical resemblance. The original Elias had been small, delicate, with narrow shoulders and fragile limbs. The sixth boy was different. He was stronger, taller, with bones that hinted at growth that would stretch him beyond the memory they clung to. To the Whitlocks, this was unacceptable. They believed that to make him truly Elias, his body itself had to be reshaped, and so they devised a method as grotesque as it was deliberate, the nightly breaking and resetting of bones. It began with his arms. The Whitlocks bound him to the same wooden chair that had silenced others, but this time the chair became an operating table. They pressed his forearm against a block and with measured force snapped the bone. The boy's scream tore through the cellar, but the thick stone walls swallowed it whole. His cries never reached the neighbors. Once broken, the arm was reset at a tighter angle, wrapped in rough bindings that forced it to heal crooked, smaller, closer to the shape of the original Elias. Night after night, the ritual continued, moving from arms to legs, from ribs to collarbone. The Whitlocks approached the task with chilling calm, never rushing, never faltering, as though they were sculptors perfecting a figure of clay. But their sculpture was a living child, and their tools were pain and bone. The boy's body weakened under the relentless assault. He learned to dread the hours after supper when the house grew still and the steps led downward. His body began to twist, his posture shrinking, his once strong frame bending inward. He limped when he walked, though the Whitlocks disguised it in public by carrying him, cooing softly about his frailty, convincing neighbors he was sickly, just like the son they once lost. The neighbors nodded with pity, never suspecting that the boy's frailty was not sickness but design. They praised the Whitlocks for their devotion, for caring so gently for a child who seemed too delicate for the world. But the boy knew the truth. His delicacy was not natural. It was manufactured through nights of agony where every scream was absorbed into the stone. The ledger recorded these acts in words so cold they felt inhuman. Correction applied to left femur, clavicle adjusted downward. Growth diminished by re-breaking. Each note treated the child's suffering as though it were no different from a carpenter measuring wood. The Whitlocks convinced themselves they were not harming him but restoring him, chiseling away the false form to reveal the true Elias hidden inside. They saw his pain not as cruelty but as progress, each broken bone another step toward resurrection. In time, the sixth Elias stopped screaming. His voice cracked, his strength failed, and silence became his only refuge. The Whitlocks saw this as the final proof of success. They paraded him with more pride than ever, showing him off as the frail angel they had remade. To the town he appeared a fragile child cared for with love. To the Whitlocks he was Elias reborn in body and spirit. But beneath the floorboards his twisted skeleton told another story, one of methodical brutality hidden behind polished shoes and fine clothes. He was both shrine and victim, a child broken not by accident but by design. Another sacrifice to a name that had become heavier than life itself. The seventh Elias came to the Whitlock house when its walls had already swallowed decades of silence, and by then the parents were older, slower in step, but sharper in their convictions. Age had not softened them. It had refined their cruelty into a ritual so smooth that it no longer felt to them like cruelty at all. They had perfected their methods through 6 broken boys, and now they were ready for their final act. This last child was welcomed into a house that had become less a home and more a shrine. A labyrinth of locked doors, hidden rooms, and portraits of a boy who had never truly returned. The Whitlocks carried themselves with the dignity of elders who believed they had achieved something holy. And they looked upon this boy not as another orphan to mold, but as their last chance to make Elias eternal. But this child was not like the others. He obeyed outwardly, nodded when told to, ate in silence, and played the role of the obedient son. Yet in the secrecy of the night he found small acts of resistance. He had seen the fear in his own eyes and understood that if he did not preserve himself in some way, he too would vanish without trace. So he began to write. He tore scraps of paper from hymnals, smoothed bits of cloth from his bedding, and with stolen ink scratched words into them. Simple sentences, fragments of memory, small affirmations that reminded him of who he was. He wrote that his name was not Elias. He wrote of the pain hidden in the cellar. He wrote of the voices that had been silenced before him. These scraps he hid carefully, sliding them into the seams of his mattress, stitching them back with clumsy hands so that no eye would see. He could not fight with strength, but he could fight with memory. The Whitlocks did not know, or perhaps they chose not to notice. They were too consumed with their final plan, a plan that went beyond silence, beyond scars, beyond broken bones. For this child, they wanted more. They wanted a memorial, something that would endure even when their own bodies failed. They had spoken for years of how the soul could be preserved in flesh, how Elias could be shaped again and again, but now they wanted to freeze him completely, to capture him in a form that could not be erased. And so they prepared the plaster. Buckets of it were mixed in the cellar, pale and heavy, the powder thick in the air. They built a vat deep enough to swallow a body whole. They told themselves this was not murder but art, not cruelty but devotion. The boy was to become their statue, their eternal Elias, a monument that would stand when breath and bone were gone. The night of the ritual came with the stillness of inevitability. The boy was led into the cellar, stripped of his clothes and lowered into the cold vat. At first he thought it was water, but soon he felt the thick weight of plaster closing over his skin, clinging, tightening as it dried. He tried to scream, but his voice was muffled by the heavy air. The Whitlocks held him still, their hands steady, their faces calm as the mixture crept over his chest, his throat, his mouth. His lungs fought for breath, but every inhale drew in the dust and weight of plaster, sealing him from within. His body thrashed, then weakened, until at last he was still, encased not in wood or soil, but in stone. The Whitlocks stood in silence, watching as their final Elias hardened before them, his small form frozen into their grotesque memorial. They did not see a child die. They saw Elias immortalized. Days later, the neighbors asked after him, and the Whitlocks gave the same answer they had given so many times before. Fever, they said, always fever. But beneath their house, in the cellar that reeked of plaster and lime, stood the pale figure of a boy forever silenced, his face frozen in terror, his small hands reaching upward, preserved not as himself but as a monument to a family's madness. What the Whitlocks could not erase, however, were the scraps of paper hidden in his mattress, the words he had written in secret waiting to be found. His body had been stolen, but his voice, against all odds, had survived. When the Whitlocks finally died, their passing was quiet, unremarkable, the slow fading of two old bodies in a house that had already consumed so many others. The town noted their deaths with polite sorrow, speaking of their devotion, of the many children they had taken in. To the neighbors, their legacy was kindness, even if tinged with strangeness. But when the doors of the house were opened and the silence inside was broken for the first time in decades, what was found did not echo kindness. It revealed horror that had been hidden in plain sight, horrors so carefully constructed that they felt less like crimes and more like rituals carved into the fabric of the building itself. The cellar was the first to give up its secrets. Boards were pried up, and beneath them lay coffins lined in a row, 7 in total, each one carefully arranged as though for display. But these were not coffins meant for burial in consecrated ground. They were makeshift boxes, sealed not with reverence but with finality, their contents trapped in the suffocating dark. Inside, bones lay curled and broken, the fragile remains of children who had once been paraded before the town as proof of the Whitlocks' charity. Yet the bones were not untouched. They bore carvings, deliberate markings etched into the skeleton itself. Some carried branching lines that mimicked the veins of leaves, others bore crude initials burned into their ribs. Others still had small holes drilled into their skulls as though the parents had tried to empty them of thought. These were not the marks of illness or accident. These were symbols, patterns meant to bind identity, to erase individuality, to reduce each child to the same hollow figure. Elias. The walls of the cellar bore their own testimony. Scratched into the stone were names, each written over and over in a child's uncertain hand. Elias, Elias, Elias. Sometimes the letters trailed off mid-word, as if written in pain or exhaustion. Sometimes they overlapped, one name scrawled over another, layer upon layer, until the stone itself seemed to pulse with repetition. In places, the writing was smeared with what could only be blood, thin streaks where small hands had pressed too hard. The cellar was no longer just a room. It was a shrine to obsession, a place where children had been stripped of voice and identity and reduced to a single word etched until the word itself lost all meaning. The plaster statue was found too. In one corner of the cellar, stiff and pale, stood the 7th Elias, encased in hardened plaster, his small body captured forever in a pose of terror. His mouth frozen open, his arms reaching upward, his form stood not as art, but as a grotesque memorial to the Whitlock's final act. Around the statue, scraps of paper were discovered, hidden deep in the seams of a mattress pulled from the corner of the room. The words written on them were uneven but clear. "My name is not Elias. They hurt us. Please remember me." These notes were the only surviving voices of the boys, fragments of memory clawed into existence by a child who knew he would not live to speak them. The community reeled at the revelations. Families who had once praised the Whitlocks now whispered in horror that they had been fooled. The church, which had blessed the adoptions and commended the Whitlocks for their piety, denied any involvement. They claimed ignorance, insisted that they had seen nothing unusual, though records later revealed that suspicions had been raised, notes had been written, and warnings had been ignored. A public inquiry began, and for the first time the town was forced to face the truth that evil had not come as a monster but as a quiet couple with calm smiles, who had hidden their madness in charity and cloaked their cruelty in ritual. As investigators catalogued the remains, as coffins were lifted from the earth beneath the house, the weight of silence became unbearable. People remembered how they had looked away, how they had believed the stories of fevers and frailty, how they had praised the Whitlocks for kindness when the signs of horror were all around them. The discovery was not just the unveiling of bones and scars. It was the unveiling of complicity, of a community that had allowed evil to thrive because it was easier to call it devotion. And though the Whitlocks were gone, their house remained standing as a hollow monument to the quiet power of cruelty when it hides behind innocence. The discovery of the Whitlock cellar spread through the town like a sickness, its details whispered in corners, denied in public, yet etched into every household like a stain that could not be scrubbed away. The deaths of 7 children under the name Elias forced officials to respond, not only to the horror itself but to the shame of having ignored it for so long. What followed was a wave of reforms, each one presented as a safeguard, a promise that no family would ever again be allowed to bury cruelty beneath the mask of charity. Orphanages, once neglected warehouses of forgotten children, were placed under stricter oversight. Adoption laws were rewritten so that records could not vanish into silence, so that the names of children would be carried with them instead of erased. Inspections became mandatory, social workers appointed, and new systems created to track every boy and girl taken into private homes. But behind the official language of reform lay the shadow of guilt, the knowledge that none of these laws could bring back the lives already broken. A memorial was raised at the edge of town, a small stone marker engraved with the words, "To the lost children of the Whitlock house." It was simple, somber, meant to be a place of mourning. For a brief time, families came to lay flowers, and the town seemed ready to face what had been hidden for decades. Yet as the years passed, the memorial grew neglected. Weeds choked its base, the stone grew dark with moss, and finally it was vandalized by locals who wanted the past buried deeper than the coffins that had been pried from the cellar floor. Some painted over the names, some shattered offerings left behind, and whispers spread that the memorial itself cursed the town by reminding them of what they had allowed to happen. It became a symbol not of healing but of denial, a reminder that people would rather forget than face the weight of their silence. Decades later, when the last of those who had known the Whitlocks were gone, secret records were unsealed. Court documents, testimonies, and private notes revealed how much had been known at the time but ignored. The parish priest's warnings had been filed away. Reports from orphanages that questioned the Whitlocks' demands had been dismissed. Neighbors who had whispered suspicions admitted years later that they had chosen not to speak loudly for fear of being mocked or ostracized. The truth was clear. The Whitlocks' crimes had not happened in total secrecy. They had happened in plain sight, nurtured by a community that found comfort in looking away. Each ignored suspicion was another nail in the coffins beneath the cellar. The unsealed records brought the case back into public conversation, sparking debates on how evil hides in ordinary shapes, how rituals of cruelty can thrive when cloaked in piety, and how often silence protects the abuser instead of the abused. But by then the Whitlock house was gone, demolished after years of standing empty, its wood rotting, its windows shattered by vandals. Only the land remained, a barren lot where nothing seemed to grow, as if the earth itself resisted the weight of what had been done there. Some argued that a new memorial should be raised, one that could not be ignored or defaced. Others argued that the land should remain untouched, a scar left visible, a warning carved into the soil. The legacy of the seven was not one of justice, but of uneasy remembrance. Laws had changed, oversight had grown stricter, yet the core truth lingered. No law could erase the silence that had allowed the Whitlocks to thrive. The children were gone, their names stolen, their bodies broken, their voices buried. What remained was the shadow of a community that failed them, a reminder that evil does not need to scream to be heard. Sometimes it only needs to whisper and for everyone else to pretend they cannot hear. Evil does not always arrive with knives drawn or voices raised. Sometimes it comes softly, with steady hands and calm smiles hiding behind the mask of devotion. The Whitlocks were not the kind of monsters people expect. They did not storm through the town in rage, nor did they flaunt their cruelty in public. They moved with dignity, spoke with grace, and prayed with conviction. And yet in the silence of their house they built a legacy of horror more enduring than any scream. Their evil was not the chaos of sudden violence, but the slow drip of methodical cruelty, a ritual that consumed years, children, and innocence in the name of love. It was the kind of evil that thrives not in shadows but in plain sight, shielded by the world's refusal to see what is uncomfortable. The Whitlocks never raised their voices, they never struck in anger. Their crimes were calculated, written down like lessons, each act disguised as ritual, each ritual disguised as devotion. To the outside world, they were pious, charitable, refined, but their restraint was not kindness, it was camouflage. They taught their neighbors that danger does not always look like rage. Sometimes it looks like calm repetition. Sometimes it looks like order. And in that order, horror grows unchecked. The Whitlocks proved that evil need not be loud to endure. It can build itself in whispers, in routines, in the silence of locked rooms where no one dares to ask questions. The question their legacy leaves is not only how they did what they did, but how they were allowed to. How could so many neighbors pass their windows and not wonder why laughter never spilled from them? How could a community accept story after story of fever without asking why death followed this family alone? How could the church record doubts and bury them in files rather than voices? The Whitlocks were not powerful. They were not untouchable. Their true weapon was silence, theirs and everyone else's. Each person who chose not to look too closely, each authority that chose not to push too hard, became another layer of protection. Evil thrived not because it was invisible, but because it was easier to pretend it was not there. This is why the Whitlocks matter. Long after their house rotted and their graves grew cold, their story is not only about what they did to 7 children, but about how communities fail the vulnerable when they choose comfort over truth. Evil often survives because it is boring, repetitive, disguised as discipline or devotion. It survives because it does not shock the eye, because it does not break the silence in ways that force us to act. And when evil learns to wear the face of normalcy, it becomes almost impossible to destroy. So we are left with a question, one that does not belong only to the past, but to the present. What do you think? Could this happen again? Could another quiet house on the edge of another town hold the same rituals, the same silence, while neighbors look away? Could another name be repeated, another identity erased, while the world praises devotion instead of asking questions? The story of the Whitlocks is not only history, it is a mirror. And what it reflects is uncomfortable. Evil thrives best when no one listens, when no one looks, when no one speaks.